While there are many good aspects in terms of the principles of the reforms, in terms of what we've seen in terms of exclusions, they've hardly lessened since my inquiry. They're still at really unacceptable levels for children with SEN in my view. And indeed, I think the numbers of children being excluded because of the off-rolling issue you refer to are massively underestimated. That's not just my view, that's the view of Ofsted when they've looked at this as well. I think it's to some extent reflected in other studies that have come out from the sector as well. And of course, if you have children being excluded and not being able to be educated, it's one of the things that massively undermines parental confidence in the system. I think it depends which bit of the system you actually look at in relation to parental confidence. So if we were to take where the system was in 2010 when I did my inquiry, I certainly think since then we can see that parental engagement in the system has dramatically increased. So if we took the inquiry as the baseline, I would conclude that parental engagement in the system has massively increased. A lot of the things we would be looking at in terms of that parental engagement didn't even exist when my inquiry was there. So we didn't have local offer, we didn't have schools information report. We've obviously moved from education, health and care plans from statements. Around 60-70% of parents are now engaged strategically in the local offer. If you look at parental confidence around education, health and care plans and individual assessments, only just over 50% of parents are saying, looking at parent carer surveys, that they are confident and feeling fully included. So I think you need to look at that picture, and I think it's quite balanced. I would say, on balance, parental engagement has increased, and parental confidence in elements of the system have increased, but we've still got quite a long way to go.
I think, in terms of parental confidence, I think increasing parental confidence was a really key driver, and increasing parental engagement was a really key driver of the reform programme, and I think the government did do a lot to try and engage parents in the reform programme, and we're now reaching 10 years of the government funding parent care forum. So I think the sort of structures for that and the engagement are at a different place than they were when Brian started his report. But it is clear that a lot of parents still have concerns, and that some parts of the system are not working in the way they should be, and not all of the vision of the reforms is yet reality. And in the current wider climate, both of other educational reforms and the financial climate, that is a real tension.
Do you think having, I mean, I think that's a fair assessment from the experiences that we've seen, but having known that there was chance to unearth more problems with the parental engagement and identifying those needs, was there enough put in place to manage that and to manage the rise in diagnosis of special educational needs, do you think?
That's a big question, I think. I think there was quite a lot of work done, quite a lot of investment in organisations who were aimed at increasing expertise in specific impairments. So the government funded organisations such as the Autism Education Trust to increase understanding of specific impairments, similar things on specific learning difficulties and so on. So I think there was a programme to help schools, to help support schools and their expertise and their understanding. The government funded the National SENCO programme, the SENCO Award, to increase the qualification and capacity and capability of SENCOs within schools. So I think there was quite a programme of action put in place at the time to try and increase expertise and support.
What do you put the rise in exclusion of SEN and the proportion of SEN in alternative provision down to?
I think the financial pressures on services is a big issue, and I think the wider accountability framework. There were significant changes to the accountability framework for schools around the same time as the SEN reforms. Now, actually, at the time, I held hopes that they would help with the move away from the sort of 5A to C GCSE as a benchmark to an accountability system that was aimed at giving schools accountability for the progress of all the pupils in the school would actually help things. But some of the evidence may suggest that's not really happened, and there is a risk that schools see the accountability system driving them to take take actions. And I think that comes back to Brian's point actually about, what is the purpose of schools and how can you get that sort of that moral purpose in terms of supporting and educating all the pupils who the school serves.
We've seen an increase in, or rather we've seen in the schools making the interpretation of their budgets through the cuts to services in-house. We've seen SEN provision alongside enrichment activity as a school considers what its absolute fundamental role is. Do you think too quickly schools are reaching for SEN cuts, and what would you encourage them to do, or what do we need to do to discourage that?
I think there's a number of problems around this. So if you look at the way schools are funded and the SEN notional budget, that's done on a formula. And so a lot of the work I do with heads and schools, those schools that are doing the right thing in relation to children with SEN, in effect get penalised because there are more children, more parents want to go to those schools because they have got the right ethos, they are doing the right things, but they don't unless you're in a very enlightened authority that delegates a lot of additional money. They don't necessarily get the financial reward and then have the capacity to keep doing that. And at the same time, other schools in the same area are let off the hook. We'd hope that the school's information report, where every school has to say what it provides, and local authority monitoring of that would create a more even playing field, but it hasn't done so. I think then, to be fair to those schools that aren't investing enough, as Stephen was saying, they're under pressures both to the accountability system and the finance system. And we're also under pressure because specialist support services are being cut. So, for example, we've got very good evidence that support of specialist teachers to the deaf, teachers to the blind, are being cut by local authorities. So then that doesn't help schools make the right decisions, and then you get the consequence that children are excluded.
I've long felt that Ofsted is playing a sort of contradictory role almost, because they are looking for academic excellence, and yet officially they ought to be certainly giving acknowledgement to those schools who are really genuinely inclusive and take real pride in what they do for children with special needs. And I think Ofsted very often doesn't take that into account at all. And so schools are described as failing or needing improvement, when actually they are doing very well by the children whom they take seriously and whose needs they really do acknowledge. So I think Ofsted does need to take a look at itself, see what it's really inspecting.
Certainly, the hope from my report and the recommendations we made was absolutely that this would change the culture within schools, and that was the whole aim of my report, that actually schools would own that they had to do the best for all of their children, and therefore it would not be viable to try and manage SEN and their failure to provide the right support for children with SEN by either off-rolling or excluding them. So we put a lot of recommendations in place, and indeed a lot flowed through into the 2014 Act, which was about changing that culture in schools. So the idea of every teacher a teacher of SEN, and then supporting those teachers.
But would you agree it's not working?
If you looked at the level of exclusions, I would agree that suggests that for too many schools it's still an option to exclude those children rather than own them and work with them. To that extent, yes.
I'll come on to you so in a second, but do you think there is gaming of the system, that there are schools carrying out these exclusion of special educational needs because of results and targets and league tables and so on?
I think not just targets and league tables, I think also they're not investing enough in their staff, their workforce, and in the specialist support services to be able to deal with those children adequately. So then when they encounter behaviour problems, when they encounter other issues that they could be able to manage if they'd invested the right support into those children, they are then using off-rolling and exclusions as a way of managing them. But we know it doesn't have to be like that. There are many excellent schools that are not doing this, that are doing the right thing, and are not excluding children. So it's not impossible, even with that unfavourable overall framework for schools to do the right thing, and so they shouldn't be let off the hook just on those grounds that it's difficult because of the accountability measures.
I echo what Brian says, though. I do think, if you say what should be done, I do think looking at the accountability measures is very important to see how schools are held to account for exclusions and particularly off-rolling and unofficial exclusions. I think that point Brian made about.
But do you agree it's widespread now?
I don't think. I mean, all I've got is the statistics
Yeah.
you've got. I think there is a concern. I think there are undoubtedly, as Brian says, schools who operate in the right way and who manage this, but clearly there is a rise in exclusions, a rise in children with special educational needs being out of education, and that is a cause for concern. And I think what Brian said about wider support for the school is important, and I think that also includes wider services like social care. So as we see cuts in social care for disabled children and their families, that may also have an impact which is beyond the school's control, but is also, a really important part of the picture.
And do you think that there should be some kind of weighting when schools are inspected, as my colleague pointed out, looking at the number of special children with special education needs there are in the school, to make sure that it's a fair system in terms of whether judging when the schools are inspected or looking at their results?
I think the inspection framework should take into account the makeup of the pupil population of the schools. There's risks in doing that in too formulaic a way, in that could put perverse incentives for over-identification of SEN, and that was a concern at the time.
Why would that be a problem? Because wouldn't it be a good thing for mainstream schools to have plenty of
children
with special educational needs?
There was concern at the time of the Green Paper, which is reflected in the change from School Action Plus and School Action to SEN support, that identifying a child as SEN could be used as a way of explaining why a child wasn't doing very well, rather than a way of identifying the support the child needed to do well. And I think that is a risk you would have to manage, that you didn't put incentives to say to schools, well, if we just say these children have special educational needs, that explains why they're not performing, we don't need to worry about it. Ofsted will say we're doing fine. It's still got to be focused around outcomes, as Brian said earlier. When the legislation was going through Parliament, the government was rightly pushed very strongly on accountability, and that's why it introduced the Ofsted CQC framework, and I think this inspection regime has been really important. The government was always clear this was going to be a transition process, and implementation was going to take time, because a lot of it, if involving culture change and shifts in ways of working, it wasn't just a straight implementation of sort of individual action. So from that point of view, it's going to take time. So the Ofsted CQC inspection has been really important in seeing how that progress is going, and I think there are worrying things that have come out of that. I think it is good that information is there, so there is a basis from which local authorities and their partners can plan and improve, and I think it's really important, because I'm not sure what the current position is, but I think it's really important that inspection regime continues. It was very much put in place first of all as a first round, see how it's gone in, but I think given what it's shown, I think it's really important that inspection regime continues.
On the Ofsted area reviews, I think they, as a concept, have been a brilliant success. I would totally agree with Stephen that they need repeating. My experience was that just before they were brought in, that many local authorities were beginning to take their foot off the pedal in terms of the reforms. They got through 2014, they were in place, and I think the inspections have really refocused that. I would go further and say there ought to be automatic re-inspections of those authorities where they've received a letter of notice to improve, and that was running at roughly 40% at one point. So I totally take your point about it's uncovering a lot of areas where the legislation certainly isn't as embedded and as working in the way that we would have hoped it done in terms of parental engagement and in terms of some of the other issues they've uncovered. And I think that would be a very good accountability mechanism, because it's very clear that local authority leaders do take those inspections very seriously. Changes do happen as a result of them, and they're a very good way of leveraging accountability in the system.
The 1970s, the local educational authorities were on the whole regarded as extremely benign institutions. People, parents, tended to trust our local educational authorities, actually regard them as allies, on behalf of their children. And this is something that I think is worth saying, because I'm probably the only person present who can remember this benign time when local education authorities rarely were trusted to take an interest in their own children and to regard them as their own children. And they were a source of great support and also great faith, really, to parents and children. I think it's worth saying this because the 1981 Education Act that came out of the report was really the very worst year for finances, and it was from then on that both universities and schools began really to feel financial pressure, and from that moment on the local education authorities gradually became not allies but opponents, because they were forever trying to save money. And I think 1981 was a very significant year. I remember it very clearly, not only because of the Act, but because my husband became Vice Chancellor of Oxford that year, and it was the very year when the universities started to feel the tremendous Thatcher cuts. And so it was a disastrous year, really, for the Act to come out, because right from the start it became clear that there were going to be far more financial pressures than we in our innocence had thought when we actually published the report in 1978. So I think it really was from that moment on that things started to go wrong, really, because entirely for financial reasons, not for conceptual reasons.
We have to make sure the specialist support services that go around schools and support the SENCOs within schools are fully supported. And so the recent funding changes, which you may want to come on to, in terms of actually making more of a ring fence around the high needs block, has already dramatically, I think, impacted on the role of specialist support services. So for autism, for sensory impairment, for language and communication, you could get the same picture across the piece, I think, in terms of where that's then degrading the capacity of the system to deal with those children, and then you're getting the kind of figures you're talking about. So I think the principles behind the legislation are still absolutely right, in terms of every child should have a plan. At a certain point, if the school can't cope with those children, then there should be a statutory plan to put extra resources in place. I think those principles were absolutely right. The problem is ensuring that there's the right investment and focus going in the system to actually deliver that.
I still have very grave doubts about the feasibility of integration as a general principle. Well, the rightness of integration as a general principle, because I believe that there is a really considerable number of children who don't and will never flourish in a large school. I think there are hazards that people are not terribly good at noticing about large schools. I mean, obviously a lot of children flourish in large schools, but a lot don't. And these children may turn out, if they were only in a small school, might turn out really not to have any special educational needs, but to get on perfectly well. And the needs are actually, if not created, to generate compounded by the size of the impersonality of the environment. And I think that this is a perfectly general observation that was valid at the time of our report and is valid just as much now. So that I do believe in, I mean, this may be an impossible ideal, but I do believe in the value of there being some small or smallish secondary schools. On the whole, children at primary school age do better. Usually because their teachers are nicer, so to speak. I mean, nicer for the children, not so insistent on the academic as the sole value and so on. I don't have nearly so many anxieties about what I could call difficult children in primary schools. But in secondary schools, I think the climate changes very radically. And in year 7. And I think that a lot of children don't get enough attention from teachers in their first year in secondary school, and then start failing from then on. And I believe that this is an area which heads of schools ought to pay particular attention to, namely how children are treated, picked out, assessed, constantly looked at in their first year of secondary school. I think a lot of later problems could be solved or never arise if that were only a priority for most heads.
I think, I mean, the issue of inclusion versus special schools was and this versus specialist education was quite a sort of a big one during the development of the Green Paper and the legislation, with really quite strongly held and differing views across the sector. What the government did, and I think this was right, was really keep the arrangements and keep the balance as it previously was, which is there should be a qualified right to mainstream education if that's what parents want, but parental preference should also be a driver. The evidence showed that with the right support, children with special educational needs can thrive in special schools or in mainstream schools. There isn't, depending on the needs and the support in place, but there isn't a sort of hard and fast rule which says you'll do better or children do better in one or in the other. So the government really kept that sort of parental, that right, qualified right to, and quite minor qualification, but that right to mainstream, but with that parental preference driving as a key part of the regime. Attempted to change some of the funding incentives to mean that choice when made by local authorities was not driven by false funding decisions about how, for example, funding places in the non-maintained special school sector were, to make that equivalent to funding places in the maintained sector, and put in place arrangements to allow some growth in the special school sector, particularly through the free schools programme. So I think the government took the right, my view, took the right balance there, and keeping the settlements in the same place, but having parental preference really as a driver.
Brian.
Yeah, I would agree the government got the balance right in terms of the presumption towards inclusion, but parental choice around that, and so I would agree with everything Stephen said. What would worry me about the way that's played out to some extent is we have seen a rise in the number of children in special schools, and also a lot of children being placed outside of county in special provision. And I would just raise a question about whether that's also indicating that we haven't succeeded in giving parents enough confidence about what schools are doing for their children, and then even within an authority, whether special schools within that authority are good enough for their children. And the Lenihan reviews already raised this question of the number of children that we're actually sending hundreds of miles from their home because provision isn't available within that authority. So I would want to see a continuum of provision for children. I would worry that the number of children currently at special schools, there's no absolute right or wrong answer to what the number should be, but that we've actually seen a growth may indicate that we're not doing enough to make sure that actually our schools and even our in-authority special schools are supported well enough to do this. And I'd also raise a point about social care here, that certainly in my work with special school heads, they have often raised with me the issue that they think their local authority special school could often look after children in their area, but the wraparound social care provision is not available for those children. That's driving children to out-of-county placements that are, by definition, far more expensive, and that's money the authority then might be able to be spending on investing on their in-authority provision and making sure that was right for families. No, if you look at the recent survey done by Derby University into 13,000 families, actually around 2/3 of parents said they actually liked the overall process of getting an EHC plan, and 75% of parents said that the process was family-centred. So I think the overall plan, especially for those receiving new education, health and care plans, rather than in the last year of the transfer process, has been working quite well for a majority of parents. I don't think that the health and social care integration of that has been working well at all. And Ofsted, which you quoted earlier, were very clear that in a lot of instances that isn't working. But again, there are instances where it is, and again we need to look at that and say, well, why are some people able to do this and other authorities not?
Yes, and why is that? Is that a question of leadership?
It's a question of leadership, it's a question of commitment on those involved, it's a question...
So how do we get better leaders across the board?
Well, in part, the medical profession is not overall performing well in the area of children's mental health. And if they were absolutely 100% interested in and competent in children's mental health, then their contribution to the whole educational scene would be completely different. But at the moment, it's
Absolutely.
It's very poor.
Absolutely. No, I would agree. There are some areas where children's mental health, the services just aren't there. Speech and language therapy services aren't there in the way they should be. But what you therefore need is good leadership locally that does bring these services together and being held more accountable for things like the local offer.
How do you get better leadership across the board? As there's such a variation between, there are some great local authorities doing wonderful things for children with special education needs and others clearly failing.
I think one of the mistakes when the local offer was introduced, and I'm a great fan of the local offer, was that there weren't enough accountability measures in it to hold authorities to account where they didn't do that joint commissioning and joint planning. And what we need is more accountability within those measures. So again, I think the local offer is great. I think using joint commissioning is great, but nothing happens when people don't deliver on that. All you've got is the Ofsted area reviews, and they're making some difference, but I think you need some way that parents or people in the system can actually trigger some kind of investigation where that isn't actually happening. But then you've got to come back to the culture of the system. If you don't have good leadership, you don't have people committed to this and are being held accountable to it, it isn't going to happen. Whether it's the statements or whether it's no education, health and care plans, we're seeing the same issues with the new system as we saw with the old ones. If you don't get the culture, you don't get the leadership right, you don't get commitment to inclusion right, it doesn't happen.
Yeah. So we've obviously got the triumvirate of health, social care and education all playing a role here. And I sense that from the answers that you've given, or evidence that you've given, that they're not necessarily all pulling even the same direction or pulling their weight. And so what would the challenges be if the government attempted to make duties on all parties equal, whether that's through, I presume, accountability? Brian, right?
Yeah, that's obviously one reason it falls down, is that health and social care haven't got the same level of accountability. I believe under Jeremy Hunt, at least if the health provision appears in a plan, then it's got to be delivered, and that was certainly an improvement. I think the challenge is simply that the protections in the education bit of the plan are actually quite unique across the whole system. And my understanding of the debate at the time, when this was tried to be included in the legislation, is that health and social care will always resist, because they feel if they had to do it for this particular group of children, then they'd have to do it for other people, and it would extend across the system. So I think that's the particular challenge there.
Yeah, I think the Children and Families Act, although it's always essentially be a cover health and social care, this part still came from an education perspective,
yes.
And I think it has to a large degree. I mean, there's clear issues about implementation, but I think to a large degree it's made a good fist of that. I think the legislation around health and social care for disabled children is much more convoluted. It goes back 50 years. various different pieces of legislation, pieces of guidance. I think there is a real case, and that's one of the calls of the Disabled Children's Partnership, for a more fundamental review of the health and social care law as it affects disabled children. And going back to the leadership point, I think we also think it would be good if that leadership started at government level, and there was a clear ministerial priority and lead across departments for education, health and social care for disabled children.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Emma.
Morning. Both of your reports looked into teacher training.
Sorry, I feel started.
No, it's fine. It's the whole accent. Both of your reports looked into teacher training. Do you think the government has done enough to deal with this as an issue? And I say this partly as a former primary teacher who had no specialist training on children with SEND at all. Do you think enough has been done now to deal with this?
There's still a great deficiency in teacher training. To introduce the sort of basic concept that there are going to be children with special needs in every class. I still think that after all these years, as far as I know, teachers are introduced to this idea, certainly, but as a kind of extra hanging on bit. It's not really central to teacher training still. And I think that this ought to have got better now that so much training of teachers is in schools, but I'm not sure that it has actually got better, because I don't know that the people responsible, the SENCO in school, has enough authority to insist that teachers do take account of children with special needs in the ordinary classroom, and that the SENCO ought to be there in the classroom, seeing that the teacher does take account of the whole range of abilities of people in the classroom. I still think that there are some schools, not all, but some schools where children with special needs are allocated to someone who sits beside them and actually does the work for them, rather than their being sure to engage in what's going on themselves.
Thank you. Brian, what's your thoughts?
No, I don't think enough has been done, but I don't think it's simply about loading even more courses on SEN into initial teacher training. The government did move from half a day to a day, I think it was. I don't think just sort of moving to another half a day is what's going to make the difference. I would agree with what you were saying, that really it's more about changing the culture and expectations that teachers have of pupils with SEN, and that's what I would like to see embedded from the beginning of initial teacher training. I then think much more has to then come in terms of the support from the SENCO, on-the-job training over time, again the role of specialist services to support the teacher in that role. But I think it needs to go back to a fundamental kind of expectation that yes, every teacher is a teacher of SEN, but what that really means is that every teacher has an aspiration to deliver the best outcomes for all the children with SEN in their classroom.
And this goes back to what you were saying about using SEN as an excuse for the child not performing.
Exactly so.
Rather than actually treating it as a challenge to be
Exactly
met.
So I wanted it not, thinking of training as continued professional development, how do we then ensure that teachers are getting that support all the way through, getting the support from the SENCO, getting the support from specialist support services, and knowing when to do which. Because I think part of the problem has been, with the understandable focus on getting education, health and care plans in place, we haven't had a focus to now. The government is now moving on to this and beginning to focus on this. For the first 4 years of implementation, we didn't have enough focus on the children that didn't have plans.
Thank you.
I'd agree with what Brian said there. I think the government needs to make sure the resources are there in terms of the materials and the expertise, and I think it has done a lot on that, as Brian said, funding Achievement for All in its early days, as I said earlier, funding resources from specific impairments, teaching special schools as teaching schools, funding the National Senko Award, funding scholarships for teachers to take higher level qualifications and so on. Make sure those resources are there, and then making sure actually the levers on schools, because the primary responsibility for the continual professional development of staff is with the schools they are in. So if the accountability framework is right, if the levers of schools are right, that they're going to be judged on how their children with special educational needs are doing, they are going to invest those resources they have on training in a different way, and that is actually the way to drive it.
£6,000 per pupil, is that enough?
I wish it was even that, because the whole way the delegated budget works, although we talk about this notional £6,000 per pupil, that's massively confusing for parents that often think, therefore, my individual child at SEN support level has got an entitlement to £6,000 of support. And of course that isn't true. If every child at SEN support got £6,000, the school budget for SEN would be bust. So again, I would go back to, I think schools need more money delegated to them for SEN support, and we need to look at something. You have the mechanism for pupil premium, where schools get additional money for what they do around that, but schools don't get additional money for when they need to invest in children with SEN beyond their delegated budget. So we need to align the needs of children in schools with the actual budget a school gets.
Should there be a special needs premium as such on top of
something like it? I think it'd be very welcome, yes.
And just
sorry, Robert, just for the record, I think in answer to your question, people in the public gallery were shaking their heads vigorously, so yeah.
And just very briefly, we could just ask the last question. Something like only 16% of parents and young people, according to you, said they were offered the option of taking up a personal budget, and apparently it's quite low, the uptake, and some local authorities are not offering it, and so on and so forth. How do we change that? Because that was a very exciting part of the reforms, potentially.
How do we change it? I think they're so complex to arrange and so difficult to work out how they would be used.
And is there a requirement on every local authority to offer them?
Yes. As part of the discussion around an education, health and care plan, local authorities are supposed to discuss with parents whether it would be appropriate in relation to the provision they're suggesting for there to be a personal budget, and to talk them through the options to do that.
And some are not, though?
No.
Yeah. So is there any, what are the measures one can take? Are there any enforcement?
I think parents need to be made more aware of the option to have personal budgets. They need to be well supported to exercise those, because often they are complex to do, and there need to be less regulation. I forget now, but there's something like over 10 pages of regulation, wasn't there, around governing the use of personal budgets. So they're overly complex.